1:44 a.m. Eastern Mediterranean. The USS Gerald R's Ford Carrier Strike Group was operating 210 nautical miles northwest of Cyprus in the open Mediterranean, maintaining its presence as part of the 6th Fleet's sustained forward deployment posture. The Gerald Ford was the largest warship ever built, 100,000 tons of displacement, 337 meters of flight deck, a crew of 4,539 personnel, and an air wing of 75 aircraft. Its presence in the eastern Mediterranean had been continuous for 47 days, and in those 47 days its Aegis escort destroyers had collectively intercepted 31 Houthi-affiliated drone systems and 4 ballistic missiles from the Levantine approaches. The crew had developed the kind of operational rhythm that comes from sustained engagement. Watchstanders who had been through 31 intercepts knew what an inbound contact looked like, how long the engagement sequence took, and what their particular role in that sequence required. None of that experience had prepared them for what the SBIR's satellite and the ship's own radar registered simultaneously at 1:44:33 a.m. 411 individual airborne contacts. Simultaneous activation across an arc spanning 180 degrees from northwest to southeast, altitudes ranging from 8 to 340 meters, bearing geometries converging on the Gerald Ford from 8 separate approach vectors, speed profiles consistent with commercially available quadrotor and fixed-wing FPV systems, maximum velocities between 90 and 180 kilometers per hour depending on platform type. Each contact carrying what the intelligence assessment transmitted by a P-8A Poseidon that had been maintaining surveillance over the eastern Mediterranean's threat corridors had characterized as a probable explosive payload of between 0.8 and 4.5 kilograms, 411. The Aegis fire control system on USS Gerald Ford and its 3 escort destroyers, USS Ramage, USS Gravely, and USS Cole, had a combined simultaneous engagement capacity against air contacts of approximately 120 tracks, at the relevant low-altitude engagement geometries required for the drone profiles. 120 engagements against 411 inbound contacts left 291 without an assigned interceptor in the first engagement wave. Against ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, the Aegis architecture was designed for this scenario. Successive layers handled what the outer layer missed. Against 411 simultaneous low-altitude drone contacts approaching from 8 vectors at speeds too slow for radar-guided missiles and too fast for visual engagement, the layered architecture worked differently. The SM-2 and SM-6 interceptors that formed the backbone of the Aegis engagement suite were not optimized for sub-100-meter altitude contacts below 100 kilometers per hour. They were nuclear-age systems built for nuclear-era adversaries. The drones were not a conventional peer-era challenge. They were a consumer electronics threat. The strike group's commanding admiral recognized the architecture mismatch in the first 14 seconds after the contacts appeared. The Aegis system was still building engagement solutions. The Sparrow launchers on the Gerald Ford were cycling. The 2 Phalanx CIWS mounts on the carrier's flight deck and the 4 CIWS mounts distributed across the 3 destroyers were tracking. But the CIWS mounts had a combined maximum slew rate that, against 411 simultaneous contacts from 8 vectors, meant each mount would handle approximately 50 contacts in sequence, at a rate that depended on their ability to shift between targets faster than the contacts closed the engagement range. What the architecture needed was something that had been operational for 11 months. And whose deployment to the Gerald Ford Carrier Group 34 days earlier had been a deliberate decision made in direct response to the intelligence assessment that the threat profile the group would face in the eastern Mediterranean had evolved significantly from the risk profile of any previous Mediterranean deployment. The HELIOS system, high-energy laser with integrated optical dazzler and surveillance, was installed on USS Ramage. a 60-kilowatt solid-state laser capable of sustained engagement against drone-class targets at ranges up to 5 kilometers, with an engagement cycle time that was not measured in the seconds that a missile required, but in the fractions of a second required to focus a laser beam on a target and maintain it long enough to produce electronic or structural failure. Against a quadrotor drone at 2 kilometers range, the engagement time was approximately 0.8 seconds. Against a larger fixed-wing FPV at 4 kilometers, approximately 2.1 seconds. The system could shift between targets in under 0.1 seconds. It did not require a reload cycle. It did not expend ordnance. Its only limitation was thermal management. Sustained operation at maximum power required cooling cycles that limited its continuous operational tempo to bursts of approximately 4 minutes before a 90-second thermal management pause. At 1:44:47 a.m., 14 seconds after the contacts appeared, the HELIOS system was authorized to engage and began its first operational use against an actual massed drone engagement. The closing timeline was not generous. The outermost contacts at 340 meters altitude and 140 kilometers per hour were approximately 19 minutes from the Gerald Ford at the moment of detection. The innermost contacts at 8 meters altitude and 90 kilometers per hour were 14 minutes away, and the 8-meter contacts were the hardest problem for the Aegis radar geometry, which experienced ground clutter effects at very low altitudes over water that reduced its tracking reliability. The combined engagement sequence that began at 1:44:47 a.m. operated across 5 simultaneous layers. HELIOS on USS Ramage began systematic engagement of the leading edge of the northwestern approach vector. The largest cluster, 94 contacts on the most direct approach to the carrier. At 0.8 to 2.1 seconds per target engagement plus 0.1 seconds slew time. HELIOS could engage approximately 25 to 30 targets per minute under ideal conditions. Against 94 targets in the northwestern sector with a 4-minute operational window before thermal management pause, the system could address approximately 100 to 120 engagements before requiring a cooling cycle. In the first 4 minutes, it engaged 47 contacts in the northwestern sector. 44 resulted in confirmed system failure, electronic disruption of the flight control unit, or structural damage sufficient to produce loss of controlled flight. 3 contacts in the sector executed evasive maneuvers after receiving partial laser dwell that disrupted their guidance but did not produce immediate failure. They continued on degraded trajectories that were subsequently assigned to the CIWS layer. The Sparrow RIM-7 missiles from the Gerald Ford's launchers engaged the medium-altitude fixed-wing contacts, the highest-value targets in the swarm, assessed as carrying the largest explosive payloads, flying at altitudes above 150 meters where the Sparrow's semi-active radar homing was most effective. 24 contacts, 16 Sparrow engagements, 14 confirmed neutralizations. 2 contacts defeated the Sparrow's seeker through electronic countermeasures. Commercially available drone ECM systems that the intelligence assessment had flagged as probable components of the swarm's technical architecture but had not confirmed. Both contacts continued toward the carrier. The Phalanx CIWS network engaged in a sequenced pattern coordinated by the carrier group's Joint Tactical Network, which distributed targeting authority across the 6 mounts based on engagement geometry and contact priority. The CIWS's 20mm M61 Vulcan cannon at 4,500 rounds per minute produced a cone of fire that was highly effective against contacts within its engagement envelope, typically 500 to 1,500 meters range for drone-sized targets. In the first 6 minutes of engagement, the 6 CIWS mounts collectively engaged 187 contacts and achieved 149 confirmed neutralizations. 38 contacts passed through or around the CIWS engagement geometry without being successfully engaged. a combination of contacts that approached from angles where two CIWS mounts fields of fire overlapped without either having a clean engagement solution. Contacts that reached the CIWS engagement range during the brief periods when a mount was cycling between targets, and contacts that flew at altitudes below the CIWS's minimum elevation depression angle at very close range. The swarm's design reflected a level of operational sophistication that distinguished it from the individual drone operations that the strike group had been intercepting for 47 days. Launching 411 platforms simultaneously from dispersed positions required a coordination architecture. Either a centralized command system capable of synchronizing 411 separate release triggers, or a pre-programmed swarm protocol in which each platform was loaded with its approach vector, altitude profile, and activation timestamp before launch, allowing the entire engagement to proceed without real-time command and control after the initial activation. The intelligence assessment, updated in real time as the engagement unfolded, assessed the probable architecture as a hybrid. 8 separate launch clusters, each with its own coordination node, all synchronized to a shared activation timestamp distributed in the pre-launch preparation phase. This architecture was significant because it was resilient, neutralizing any single coordination node after the activation timestamp had passed would not affect the swarm's autonomous progress. The 411 platforms were autonomous from the moment of launch. Each carried its own guidance, its own target waypoints, and its own terminal homing logic. There was no command node to target. There was no network to disrupt. There was only the engagement sequence, executing independently on 411 separate platforms. The Gerald Ford's flight deck had been cleared of all personnel and all aircraft at 1:44:51 a.m. 18 seconds after contact detection, 4 seconds after HELIOS authorization. The flight deck clearance was the most critical single action of the first minute. The Ford's deck was 337 meters of exposed surface carrying aviation fuel lines, ordnance handling equipment, and electrical systems. A 4-kilogram explosive payload impacting the deck in the wrong location at the wrong moment was not a catastrophic risk to a 100,000-ton warship, but it was a significant risk to personnel, to aircraft, and to the deck equipment that made flight operations possible. Clearing the deck in 18 seconds required a well-drilled emergency procedure. The Gerald Ford's crew had drilled it 7 times in the preceding 34 days. The 8th iteration was the real one. The F/A-18E and F-35C aircraft of the Ford's air wing that had been on ready alert status were airborne at 1:45:29 a.m., 56 seconds after contact detection. 4 F/A-18Es configured with AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles and strafing capable for drone engagement, not with air-to-air loadouts designed for peer adversary aircraft. The Sidewinder's infrared seeker could acquire drone-class thermal signatures at ranges of approximately 2 to 3 kilometers for the larger fixed-wing variants. Against quadrotors whose thermal signature was dominated by small electric motors, the Sidewinder's acquisition geometry was less reliable. The F/A-18Es operated in the medium altitude band above 500 meters using their radar and visual sensors to direct Sidewinder engagements against the highest altitude contacts while using their 20mm M61 cannons against contacts in the 200 to 500 meter band. In 11 minutes of engagement between 1:45:29 a.m. and 1:56:44 a.m., the 4 F/A-18Es achieved 31 confirmed drone neutralizations using Sidewinder and gun. The 2 contacts that had defeated the Sparrow seeker reached the Gerald Ford's immediate defensive perimeter at 1:51:14 a.m. Both were engaged by CIWS at 800 meters range. One was neutralized. The second impacted the Gerald Ford's portside sponson, the reinforced structural element below and outboard of the flight deck level. At 1:51:19 a.m., the contact carried a 3.2 kilogram shaped charge payload. The detonation produced a 0.4-meter breach in the sponson's outer plating. No personnel were in the area. The deck clearance order had extended to all exterior sponson positions at 1:44:51 a.m. No critical systems were in the breach area. The sponson sustained structural damage assessed as repairable at the next port facility. The Gerald Ford's operational status was not affected. Of 411 contacts in the initial swarm activation, 392 were neutralized before reaching the Gerald Ford's hull. 19 reached the carrier group's innermost defensive layer. 18 were neutralized by CIWS. 1 impacted. Crew injuries, 0. Operational status of the Gerald Ford, fully combat capable. 1 sponson requiring repair. The accounting that followed the engagement was the part the carrier group's commanding admiral found most analytically significant. More significant in some respects than the engagement itself. 411 drones. At an assessed cost of between $800 and $3,200 per platform, depending on type, the total adversary investment in the swarm was estimated at between $330,000 and $1.32 million. Call it $800,000 as a midpoint. The U.S. expenditure in the engagement, 16 Sparrow missiles at $165,000 each. 31 AIM-9X Sidewinders at $381,000 each. Approximately 340,000 rounds of 20mm CIWS ammunition at a unit cost of approximately $6 per round, and fuel for the F/A-18E sorties. Total engagement cost to the U.S. approximately $16.4 million, against an $800,000 adversary investment, an exchange ratio of 1 to 20.5 in the adversary's favor. The HELIOS system's engagement cost, approximately $1.80 per activation in electrical power consumption, 47 engagements. $84.60 in energy expenditure. The system had engaged 47 contacts for less than the cost of 1 Sea Sparrow's maintenance cycle. The thermal management pause that the HELIOS system required at 4-minute intervals was the engagement's primary operational constraint. At 1:48:51 a.m., exactly 4 minutes after first engagement, HELIOS entered its 90-second cooling cycle. During those 90 seconds, the 47 contacts it had been progressively addressing in the northwestern sector had been reduced to a manageable residual that the CIWS and F/A-18E layer absorbed without significant increase in workload. When HELIOS resumed at 1:50:21 a.m., it reoriented to the southeastern approach vector, the second largest cluster, 73 contacts that had been partially engaged by CIWS during the first HELIOS operational cycle. The second 4-minute cycle achieved 39 engagements, 36 confirmed. The combined 2-cycle HELIOS total was 86 engagements, 80 confirmed, addressing roughly 21% of the entire swarm at a total energy cost of approximately $154.80. The economics of the engagement were the number that the Navy's acquisition community would spend the following 14 months processing. The fundamental arithmetic was simple and had been known in principle for years. A directed energy system that could engage drone-class targets at marginal cost per engagement fundamentally altered the economic calculus that made drone swarm operations attractive to adversaries. A $3,200 drone that required a $165,000 Sea Sparrow interceptor represented a favorable exchange ratio for the adversary. A $3,200 drone that could be neutralized by $1.80 of electricity did not. The question was not whether HELIOS worked. The 80 confirmed engagements in the Gerald Ford engagement answered that question. The question was whether the system could be produced, deployed, and maintained at a scale that covered the fleet's exposure. The Gerald Ford engagement answered that question too, though the answer required more than a classified report to translate into program budget. The commanding admiral's after-action report, classified and transmitted to NAVSouth and the CNO at 4 a.m., contained one sentence that was subsequently quoted in 3 separate classified research and development program reviews. The mathematics of this engagement confirm that kinetic interceptors against drone swarms are a transitional solution, not a permanent one. Helios performed as required. We need more of it on every hull before the next iteration of this scenario increases from 411 to 4,000. The next iteration, the one his report had anticipated, did not come that deployment. It came 11 months later against a different carrier group in the same waters. By then, 2 additional Aegis destroyers in the 6th Fleet had been fitted with Helios systems. The engagement parameters were different. The outcome was not. The 14 minutes and 31 seconds from first contact to last contact resolved contained a data density that the after-action analysis team would spend 6 weeks processing into a comprehensive engagement database. Every Helios dwell time, every CIWS slew event, every Sea Sparrow launch and intercept, every F/A-18E gun pass, all of it recorded by the Gerald Ford's own sensor suite and by the P-8A overhead whose surveillance feed had captured the entire engagement from above. The database would become the foundational reference for the next iteration of drone swarm engagement doctrine, which was classified at the highest level and distributed to the commands most likely to face the scenario in the near term. The doctrine addressed 4 questions that the Gerald Ford engagement had answered partially and posed fully. How to optimize the Helios engagement sequence against a swarm distributed across multiple vectors simultaneously. How to coordinate the transition between Helios operational cycles and CIWS coverage during thermal management pauses. How to allocate F/A-18E assets between the medium-altitude fixed-wing contacts and the low-altitude quadrotor contacts that represented different engagement geometries, and how to prioritize within a 411 contact engagement picture when the engagement capacity was 120 and every system was at maximum utilization simultaneously. The doctrine also addressed the one contact that had reached the hull. The forensic analysis of the sponson impact conducted by the Ford's damage assessment team and supplemented by the engagement data determined that the contact had entered the CIWS engagement envelope during the 0.4 second interval between one CIWS mount, completing a burst on the previous contact and completing its slew to the new contact's bearing, 0.4 seconds. At 90 kilometers per hour, 0.4 seconds represented 10 meters of closing distance. The contact had entered the gap in the CIWS slew sequence by 10 meters. The doctrine update that addressed this gap required a modification to the CIWS targeting priority algorithm that reduced the mount slew time between targets by pre-computing the next contact's bearing while the current engagement was in its final 0.2 seconds. The modification was applied to all CIWS mounts in the 6th Fleet within 11 days of the engagement. Time from first contact detection to engagement authorization, 14 seconds. Total contacts, 411. Helios engagements, 47-44 confirmed. Sea Sparrow engagements, 16-14 confirmed. CIWS engagements, 187-149 confirmed. F/A-18. E engagements 31 confirmed. Total neutralized 392 of 411. Contacts reaching inner perimeter 19. Contacts impacting hull 1. Crew injuries 0. Gerald Ford operational status fully capable minor structural damage. Adversary swarm cost estimate $800,000. U.S. engagement cost $16.4 million. Helios cost per engagement $1.80. Time from detection to all contacts resolved 14 minutes 31 seconds. The drone was not a new system. The quadrotor had been commercially available for a decade. The FPV platform had been a consumer product since 2016. What was new at 1:44 a.m. was the scale and the coordination. 411 simultaneous activations from 8 vectors, timed to compress all defensive engagement layers into a 14-minute window simultaneously rather than sequentially. The architecture that answered it had been installed on USS Ramage 34 days before the engagement, had never been used in an actual massed engagement before that night, and had performed within 6% of its design parameters on first operational use. The margin between 392 neutralized and 411 launched was the margin between a sponson repair and something more consequential. That margin had been produced by 11 months of system development, 34 days of deployment preparation, 18 seconds of flight deck clearance, and 0.8 seconds of laser dwell time per target. The adversary had invested $800,000 and had produced a sponson breach, 0 crew injuries, and a classified after-action report that accelerated the U.S. Navy's laser weapons deployment program by 14 months.